Body horror is built on the most intimate fear available. Not what is outside you, but what is inside you, and what it might become. The flesh you live in is not as stable as it feels. It can change. It can be changed. It can betray you in ways that no external threat could. Hi, this is Movie Blanket Club. Today we are counting down the top 20 best body horror movies of all time. From Cronenberg's earliest experiments in flesh to the Antarctic research station, where something wearing a human face decided it was comfortable there. Your body is already listening. 20. Shivers, 1975. David Cronenberg's debut feature is the film that established the thematic territory he would spend the next 3 decades exploring. Flesh as a site of political and philosophical conflict rather than simply biological process. A luxury apartment complex on a Montreal island becomes infected with a parasitic organism engineered by a doctor who believed humanity had become dangerously over-cerebral and needed to be returned to its animal nature. The parasite is transmitted sexually. It produces in its host an overwhelming, undiscriminating libido, which means the residents of Starliner Towers begin spreading it through every social mechanism the building provides. Cronenberg shoots the complex, designed to be self-contained, to provide everything a resident might need without leaving, as the ideal vector for an epidemic. And the film understands that the horror is not the parasite, but the system the parasite exploits. The criticism most fairly made is that Shivers is rough in ways that Cronenberg's later work is not. The performances vary, the pacing is uneven, and some sequences have a cheapness that the budget explains but does not entirely excuse. What cannot be argued is that the film's central image, a bathtub and what moves up through the drain, is one of the genre's founding moments. Everything Cronenberg made after this is a refinement of what Shivers established. 19. Society, 1989. Brian Yuzna's film is the most formally surprising entry on this list. A body horror film disguised as a Beverly Hills teen drama for its entire first hour, in which a high school student named Bill Whitney suspects his wealthy family and their social circle are concealing something from him. And the film plays this as paranoid psychology before revealing that his suspicions are entirely correct. The wealthy elite of Beverly Hills are a separate species who periodically gather for a ritual called the shunt, in which human bodies are used in ways that the film's climax renders, with a practical effects ambition that remains genuinely shocking 35 years later. Screaming Mad George created the shunt sequence, in which bodies merge, absorb, and reconfigure each other in configurations that suggest a class relationship made literal, the upper class consuming the lower class through a process that makes the metaphor into biology. Society is not a subtle film. It does not intend to be. The class anxiety it is working through is stated as directly as the practical effects that enact it. The criticism most fairly made is that the first hour is a different film from the third act, and that the tonal shift is more abrupt than graceful. The counter-argument is that the disorientation is the point. You should not see the shunt coming. 18. Rabid, 1977. Cronenberg's second feature takes the premise of Shivers, a pathogen spreading through a population transmitted through desire, and restructures it around a single protagonist whose transformation is the film's center rather than its background. A young woman named Rose survives a motorcycle accident and experimental skin graft surgery, and develops a phallic feeding organ in her armpit that she uses to feed on blood, injecting victims with a fluid that produces a rabies-like madness. She does not understand what she has become. Cronenberg cast Marilyn Chambers, a porn actress, in the role of Rose, a decision that was commercially strategic and thematically coherent, given that the film's horror involves desire being weaponized against the bodies of those who feel it. Rabid turns Toronto into a city under epidemic quarantine, which gives the film a scale that Shivers' single-location premise could not achieve. The criticism most often made is that Rabid is more interested in its epidemic premise than in Rose as a character, and that the film's emotional investment is distributed too broadly to produce the intimacy the genre requires. This is fair. What Rabid does with its broader canvas, the snow, the army, the bodies in the street, is establish that Cronenberg understood his subject to be not just flesh, but society. 17. Slither, 2006. James Gunn's horror comedy, made before his transition to Marvel and DC and representing his most complete genre statement, is the most purely entertaining entry on this list. A film that manages the difficult balance of being genuinely funny and genuinely disgusting in the same sequence without either quality undermining the other. An alien parasite arrives in a small South Carolina town inside a meteor and infects a wealthy local named Grant, played by Michael Rooker, who begins to transform in ways that the town gradually notices and cannot explain. The parasite uses Grant as a vector to infect other residents, who are absorbed into a collective biological intelligence and converted into slug-bearing zombies under central control. Elizabeth Banks plays Grant's wife Starla, and her performance carries the film's emotional stakes through sequences that require a commitment to practical effects absurdity that most actors would find professionally difficult. Gunn's formal achievement is tonal control. Slither knows exactly when to make you laugh and exactly when to make you look away, and it deploys both responses with a precision that the genre rarely achieves in comedic mode. The criticism most commonly made is that Slither is too funny to be genuinely scary. The counter-argument is that Gunn is not trying to scare you. He is trying to make you feel the genre in your body, and he succeeds. 16. Titane, 2021. Julia Ducournau's Palme d'Or winner is the most formally extreme entry in the lower half of this list, and the film most likely to cause a viewer to question whether body horror as a category is adequate to describe what it is doing. Alexia has a titanium plate in her skull from a childhood car accident and a sexual response to automobiles, and the film follows her through a series of violent events before she disguises herself as a missing boy and is taken in by his grieving firefighter father. She is pregnant. The father knows she is not his son. Neither of them acknowledges either of these facts. Ducournau is making a film about gender, identity, grief, and the relationship between the body and the self, about what it means when the body you have does not correspond to the self you experience, and the body horror of Alexia's pregnancy, which she attempts to manage with duct tape and sheer will, is the vehicle for all of this. The criticism most often made is that Titane is deliberately alienating and rewards emotional distance over identification. This is accurate and intentional. Ducournau is not interested in making you comfortable with Alexia. She is interested in making you unable to look away from her. 15. Possessor, 2020. Brandon Cronenberg's second feature demonstrates that the elder Cronenberg's formal preoccupations are transmissible, that a filmmaker who grew up inside the vision of flesh as technology has his own things to say about it. An assassin named Tasya Voss works for a shadowy organization by having her consciousness implanted into other people's bodies, using them to commit murders before destroying the host and returning to her own body. The procedure leaves traces. The hosts do not always release cleanly. Andrea Riseborough plays Tasya, with a dissociation that suggests a person who has spent too long inhabiting other people's bodies and is no longer entirely certain which one is hers. Christopher Abbott plays Colin, the host Tasya inhabits for her most complex assignment, and the sequences in which both consciousnesses occupy the same body, competing for control, bleeding into each other, producing a face that flickers between their two identities, are the most formally disturbing images in recent body horror. Possessor is a film about the violence of identity, the way that consciousness imposed on a body that does not belong to it damages both. The criticism most fairly made is that it is cold in ways that resist emotional investment. Brandon Cronenberg would likely consider this an accurate description of what identity theft feels like from the inside. 14. The Substance, 2024. Coralie Fargeet's film is the most recent entry on this list and the most uncompromising demonstration that body horror as a genre still has extremes to reach. Demi Moore plays Elizabeth Sparkle, a fading celebrity fitness instructor who is dropped by her network producer on her 50th birthday and discovers a black market drug called the substance, which grows a younger, more perfect version of herself from her own spine. Margaret Qualley plays Sue, the younger version, and the film's premise requires both versions to share time in strict alternation, 1 week active, 1 week dormant in the original body. The horror begins when one version decides she does not want to alternate. Farjeet shoots the film with a visual excess that matches its thematic excess. Saturated colors, extreme close-ups of flesh, a camera that treats the female body as simultaneously object and subject, with a self-awareness about the distinction that the genre rarely achieves. The film's third act escalates to a practical effects finale that is the most extreme in recent cinema, and which has been described by reviewers in terms suggesting it cannot be unseen. The criticism most often made is that Farjeet's satire of Hollywood's treatment of aging women is too obvious. The counter-argument is that subtlety has not worked. The substance tries something else. 13. Hellbound, Hellraiser II, 1988. Tony Randall's sequel expands the mythology of the original film into the labyrinthine realm of the Cenobites themselves, a decision that sacrifices some of the first film's claustrophobic dread for a visual ambition that the budget only partially supports, but that the film pursues with a commitment that earns its place in the canon. Kirsty Cotton is committed to a psychiatric hospital after the events of the original, where a doctor named Channard, obsessed with the lament configuration, uses the blood of a self-harming patient to resurrect Julia Cotton from the mattress into which her body was absorbed. What follows is an expansion into the architecture of hell that gives Hellbound a visual register the original could not afford. The practical effects sequence in which Dr. Channard is transformed into a Cenobite, emerging from a cocoon of flesh, wire, and medical equipment, is the film's formal achievement, a body horror sequence that literalizes the first film's philosophical premise about the modification of flesh beyond any human limit. The criticism most fairly made is that Hellbound is messier and less disciplined than the original. This is accurate. It is also a sequel that takes its mythology seriously enough to expand it, and the expansion produces images that the first film could only imply. 12. The Brood, 1979. Cronenberg has described The Brood as his version of Kramer vs. Kramer, the film he made during his divorce, processing the experience of a custody dispute and the violence of a marriage's dissolution through the mechanisms available to him. A man named Frank Carveth is attempting to maintain custody of his daughter Candace, while his estranged wife Nola undergoes experimental psychotherapy with a charismatic doctor who believes that psychological trauma can be manifested as physical mutation. Nola's rage produces external womb sacs on her body from which small humanoid children are born, and these children enact her repressed violence against the people she holds responsible for her suffering. Oliver Reed plays the doctor with a menace disguised as therapeutic warmth. Samantha Eggar plays Nola in a performance that the film's climax requires to be simultaneously the most vulnerable and the most terrifying moment in the film. The Brood is Cronenberg's most emotionally direct film because it is working through something specific and personal. The discovery that the people closest to you can produce things that want to destroy everything you love. The body horror of the external womb, when finally shown, is disturbing in the way that only images emerging from genuine feeling can be. 11. Scanners, 1981. Cronenberg's corporate espionage thriller disguised as body horror, or body horror disguised as corporate espionage thriller, opens with one of cinema's most famous practical effects sequences and then spends the rest of its runtime earning the philosophical argument that the sequence makes. A scanner is a human being born with the ability to link telepathically with other nervous systems, to read minds, to inhabit them, and in extreme cases, to destroy them. The film opens with a demonstration of the latter. A scanner named Revok, played by Michael Ironside, causes another scanner's head to explode in a conference room. The practical effects for this sequence, achieved with a prosthetic head and a shotgun fired from beneath the set, were so successful that the image became one of the genre's defining icons within months of the film's release. Cronenberg is interested in the scanner's ability as a metaphor for corporate power, the capacity to enter another person's consciousness without consent, to weaponize intimacy, and the film's plot involves a corporation attempting to build an army of scanners for control purposes. The criticism most often made is that Scanner's narrative mechanics are less elegant than its central idea. Cronenberg would likely agree. The head is still exploding. 10. In the Mouth of Madness, 1994. John Carpenter's closing entry in his Loose Apocalypse trilogy, the series that began with The Thing and continued with Prince of Darkness, is the most formally Lovecraftian horror film ever made by a major director, and the one that most completely translates the specific dread of Lovecraft's cosmicism into cinematic language. Sam Neill plays John Trent, an insurance investigator hired to find a missing horror novelist named Sutter Kane, whose books are causing readers to go insane, and who discovers that the town described in Kane's fiction physically exists. As Trent moves deeper into Hobbs End, the boundary between reality and the text begins to dissolve. Bodies change, faces distort. The architecture behaves incorrectly, and the distinction between what is written and what is real collapses in a way that the film treats as a cosmological event rather than a psychological one. The body horror here is distributed throughout reality rather than concentrated in a single organism. The world itself is being rewritten, and the human form is being revised to accommodate something that does not recognize the category of the human. Carpenter shoots these sequences with a matter-of-fact clarity that makes the distortions more disturbing than any stylized approach could. In the Mouth of Madness is a film about the end of the human body as a stable category. 9. Raw, 2016. Julia Ducournau's debut feature, made 7 years before Titane, and the film that established her as the most important new voice in body horror, is the most emotionally coherent entry in the upper half of this list. A film that uses the mechanics of the genre to tell a story about appetite, identity, and the body's capacity to want things the conscious mind has not authorized. Justine is a lifelong vegetarian who arrives at veterinary school and is forced to eat raw rabbit meat during hazing. The hunger this awakens is specific, escalating, and directed at human flesh. Garance Marillier plays Justine with an interiority that makes the film's escalation feel like genuine psychological discovery rather than genre mechanics. A young woman who did not know this was inside her and is not certain whether to be horrified or relieved that she now does. Ella Rumpf plays Alexia, Justine's older sister and fellow student, and their sibling dynamic gives the film an emotional core that most body horror films cannot sustain. Raw screened at Cannes and at the Toronto International Film Festival, where several audience members required medical attention. The film is disturbing in the specific way that a film about hunger is disturbing. It makes you aware of what your body wants independently of what you would choose. 8. Annihilation, 2018. Alex Garland's adaptation of Jeff Vandermeer's novel is the most formally ambitious science fiction body horror film ever made, a work that uses the genre's premise to ask what it would mean for an intelligence that does not understand the concept of species to interact with biological matter and what the results of that interaction would look like. A biologist named Lena, played by Natalie Portman, joins an expedition into the Shimmer, a quarantine zone on the southern coast where something has been rewriting the rules of biology since a meteorite impact 3 years earlier. Plants grow in human shapes. Animals carry human vocal cords. The team members' DNA begins to change. Whatever is inside the Shimmer is not hostile. It simply does not recognize the distinction between organisms that the natural world takes as foundational. The lighthouse sequence in the film's third act is the most formally daring horror sequence in a major studio film of the decade, a direct confrontation with an intelligence so alien that its physical manifestation cannot be processed in conventional genre terms. The criticism most commonly made is that Annihilation is deliberately withholding, that it refuses explanation in ways that frustrate rather than unsettle. Garland's position, and the novels, is that the shimmer cannot be explained because explanation is a category it does not recognize. 7. Dead Ringers, 1988. Cronenberg's film is the most psychologically sophisticated body horror on this list, a work in which the horror is not located in physical transformation, but in the dissolution of identity between two bodies that share everything except experience. Elliot and Beverly Mantle are identical twin gynecologists who share a practice, an apartment, and every woman they have ever been with. Elliot seduces them, then passes them to Beverly without the women knowing. When Beverly falls genuinely in love with an actress named Claire Neveu, played by Geneviève Bujold, and Elliot cannot follow him there, the balance between them begins to fail. Jeremy Irons plays both twins in a performance that required months of technical preparation and produced what is almost certainly the finest acting in any Cronenberg film. Two distinct people constructed from the same body, distinguishable by posture, affect, and the specific quality of their damage. The film's body horror arrives in Beverly's designs for gynecological instruments appropriate for mutant women, the instruments of a mind that is detached from the bodies it was trained to care for. Dead Ringers is a film about the horror of being unable to be alone inside your own body, and of what happens to an identity that has never been required to exist without its double. 6. Eraserhead, 1977. David Lynch's debut feature took 5 years to complete on the grounds of the American Film Institute, was funded in part by Sissy Spacek and Jack Fisk, and remains the most formally radical body horror film ever made, a work that operates entirely below the threshold of rational language, in the register of nightmare physiology, where flesh behaves according to dream logic rather than biology. Henry Spencer lives in an industrial wasteland of perpetual hissing pipes and gray light, and discovers he has fathered a severely deformed infant with his girlfriend Mary, who leaves, and Henry must care for the child alone. The child, never explained, never categorized, constructed over years by Lynch and a small crew, using methods Lynch has never fully disclosed, is one of cinema's most disturbing practical creations, a thing that exists at the boundary of the organic and the manufactured, that produces sounds associated with suffering, and that the film requires the audience to respond to with something other than the categories they would normally apply. Lynch shot Eraserhead in the language of industrial anxiety and parental terror, and the result is a film that bypasses critical processing and acts directly on the nervous system. The dream sequences, the lady in the radiator, the worms in the bed. Eraserhead does not mean anything in the way that a film with a thesis means something. It means the way a body means. 5. Videodrome, 1983. Cronenberg's most formally complete philosophical statement is also his most prescient film, a work made in 1983 that describes a world that did not fully exist until the 21st century, in which the boundary between media consumption and bodily experience has dissolved so completely that the two have become indistinguishable. Max Wren, played by James Woods, programs a cable television channel and discovers a pirated broadcast signal called Videodrome. Pure sadism and torture, apparently unscripted, apparently real, that causes hallucinations and eventually physical mutations in its viewer. His stomach opens into a VCR slot. His hand becomes a gun. The television breathes. Debbie Harry plays Nikki Brand, a radiotherapist with a taste for pain, and her absorption into the Videodrome signal is the film's central erotic and political event. The body becoming a receiver for signals it did not choose and cannot refuse. Cronenberg is making an argument about television that now applies to every screen, that the media we consume does not merely affect our minds, but restructures our bodies around the signals it carries, that we become the things we watch, and that this process is indistinguishable from transformation. Videodrome was not widely understood on release. It has not stopped being correct since. 4. The Skin I Live In, 2011. Pedro Almodovar is not a horror director, and The Skin I Live In is not a horror film in the conventional sense, which may be why it achieves something that genre specialists cannot, constructing a body horror premise of such extreme formal ambition that it redefines what the genre is capable of discussing. Antonio Banderas plays Robert Ledgard, a brilliant plastic surgeon who has spent years developing a synthetic skin resistant to burns, fire, and insect bites, and who has been perfecting his creation on a captive subject in his private clinic. The subject is Vera, played by Elena Anaya, who lives in a room lined with surveillance cameras and paints herself on the walls and practices yoga with the composure of someone who has accepted a situation she cannot change. The film's central secret, revealed at the end of the first hour, recontextualizes everything that has preceded it and elevates The Skin I Live In from medical thriller into one of cinema's most disturbing explorations of what it means to inhabit a body that has been made for you rather than by you, that has been designed according to another person's specifications for purposes you were not consulted about. Almodovar shoots it with the visual elegance he brings to all his work, which makes the horror of what is being described more acute rather than less. Beauty and atrocity share the same frame. 3. Hellraiser, 1987. Clive Barker's adaptation of his own novella. The Hellbound Heart is the most philosophically coherent body horror film ever made, a work that constructs a complete metaphysics of flesh, in which the modification of the body is not the consequence of horror, but its aspiration, not what happens to the unprepared, but what is offered to those who seek it. Frank Cotton solves a puzzle box called the Lament Configuration, which opens a portal to a realm inhabited by Cenobites, extra-dimensional beings who have modified their own flesh to the point at which the distinction between pleasure and pain has ceased to exist, who experience sensation at a register that human beings cannot survive. Frank is torn apart and partially resurrected in the attic of his brother's new home by blood seeping through the floorboards, and the film becomes about his reconstitution, the skin growing back over the raw architecture of what remains. Andrew Robinson and Claire Higgins play the brother and his wife Julia, who becomes Frank's collaborator. The Cenobites, and particularly Pinhead, played by Doug Bradley with a stillness that suggests a being for whom urgency is beneath consideration, are the genre's most formally complete embodiment of body horror as desire. Beings who arrived where they are by following their appetites further than any other character in horror has been willing to go, and who offer the same journey to anyone holding the box. 2. The Fly, 1986. Cronenberg's masterpiece is the body horror film that proves the genre is capable of genuine tragedy, a work in which the transformation of flesh is not an external imposition, but a consequence of ambition, and in which the horror of what the body becomes is inseparable from the horror of watching someone you love become it. Jeff Goldblum plays Seth Brundle, a brilliant and socially awkward scientist who has built a teleportation device, and who invites journalist Veronica Quaife, played by Gina Davis, to document his work. He teleports himself between the pods and unknowingly splices his DNA with that of a housefly that entered the device undetected. The transformation that follows is the most emotionally performed physical deterioration in the genre's history, Goldblum charting each stage of Seth's change with a precision and a vulnerability that makes the prosthetics and the deteriorating flesh feel like a genuine medical record rather than genre mechanics. Gina Davis plays Veronica's experience of watching this happen to someone she loves with an equivalent commitment, and the film is as much hers as Goldblum's. Cronenberg has acknowledged that he was thinking about cancer and AIDS during production, about diseases that transform the body from within, that make the flesh a stranger, that cannot be reversed. The Fly is a love story about a man who becomes something his partner cannot follow him into, and about what it costs to stay anyway. 1. The Thing, 1982. John Carpenter's film is the greatest body horror film ever made, and one of the greatest horror films of any category, a work that uses its genre premise to ask a philosophical question the genre rarely attempts. How do you know that the person standing next to you is still a person? An American research station in Antarctica encounters an alien organism that can perfectly replicate any biological entity it absorbs, and the film follows the 12-man crew as they attempt to determine which of them has already been replaced. Kurt Russell plays MacReady, the helicopter pilot who becomes the crew's de facto leader, and Wilford Brimley, Keith David, and a cast of character actors play the men around him with a specificity that makes each potential loss feel like the loss of a real person. The practical effects created by Rob Bottin completed over 14 months of continuous work that hospitalized Bottin from exhaustion and required consulting with paramedics to ensure the biological plausibility of what was being depicted, remain the most formally audacious body horror effects ever produced. Chests that open into mouths, heads that detach from bodies and grow legs, bodies that merge and separate in configurations that biology has no language for. Dog things and chest defibrillator things and blood test things, each a formal argument about what the genre is capable of showing. The Thing was a commercial failure in 1982, released the same summer as E.T., and reviewed by critics who found its nihilism unwelcome. It is now understood to be one of the defining works of American horror. The Alien won that summer too. We just did not know it yet. And there you have it, the top 20 best body horror movies of all time. From Cronenberg's Parasites spreading through a Montreal apartment building to the Antarctic snow, where an alien organism discovered that the most effective hiding place is inside a person you trust. Body horror endures because the fear it addresses is unanswerable. You cannot leave your body. This is Movie Blanket Club. Tell us in the comments, which body horror film genuinely disturbed you? And which film do you think belongs on this list that we left off?